Having finished the celebration of Hebrews 1, celebration of the enthroned Christ, now having become as much greater than the angels as the name that he has inherited is greater than theirs, the author of Hebrews does what he will do several times. He interrupts the flow of his argument with an exhortation aimed directly at the audience, meant both to hold their attention, a technique called captatio benevolenti, but also to hold their attention, but also to make the takeaway very clear. While the argument of Hebrews progresses, as George Guthrie has pointed out in his book on the structure of Hebrews, the exhortations largely repeat the same basic thing, which is, as in 2:1, for this reason, because of this, it is necessary even the more, all the more, for us to hold fast to the things which have been heard, so that at some time we do not drift away. Basically, this is important stuff we're talking about here, and you need to pay attention. Yes, Christ is much greater than the angel. This is a great celebration, but it's not just a matter of celebration. It's also a matter of great seriousness, because the word, having been spoken through angels, was firm, and every transgression and disobedience received a just punishment. What was the word spoken through angels? Why, it was the law, the Jewish law. There are a number of places in the New Testament and in Second Temple Jewish literature where we find that the tradition came to be understood that the law was mediated to Moses through angels. So in Galatians 3, Paul talks about this word spoken through angels. In Acts 7, Stephen in his sermon talks about the word spoken through angels. And of course, here we have this passage in Hebrews. And so the Old Testament law given to Moses in Jewish tradition was understood to have been mediated to Moses through the angels. And so if the covenant, as it were, if the covenant that the angels were in charge of, so to speak, the old covenant, the covenant of law, that particularly the sacrificial law, I think Hebrews is concerned with later. Of course, the fact that it talks here about transgression and disobedience receiving punishment, there might be a slightly broader sense of the law here. But basically, we need to pay attention to what Jesus has said, and to this new covenant and this salvation which was spoken through the Lord. We need to pay attention to it, because if the old law had its punishments, then how much more? How will we escape? How will we ourselves escape? If those under the old covenant, the one mediated through angels, was pretty serious, and those who disregarded it faced pretty strict punishment, then how will we escape if we neglect such a great salvation, which was spoken to us through the Lord and confirmed to us by those who heard him? So this is a kind of argument that Hebrews will make a number of times. It's an argument from lesser to greater, ad a minore ad maiorem, or kal vahomer in Hebrew. It's an argument from lesser to greater. Basically, it says that if in the lesser case of the angels the punishment was bad, then how much greater will the punishment be for those who neglect this greater covenant? If Christ is greater than the angels, and the covenant mediated by angels received a pretty big punishment, then we're in big trouble if we neglect the covenant which was mediated by Christ. This doesn't sound like law and it doesn't sound like Luther's law and gospel and things are just much better. It doesn't sound like eternal security. In fact, Hebrews is disastrous for any doctrine of eternal security. Basically, the idea here is that if you thought the punishment for those who weren't faithful to the old covenant was bad, you're in humongous trouble if you don't remain faithful to this new covenant, which was mediated through the Lord. Therefore, we need to pay, the fact that Christ is greater than the angels in Hebrews 1 means that we need to pay even more attention to this new covenant, lest we drift away. By the way, another thing here in 2:3, this verse, there are all kinds of arguments why it's not likely that Paul wrote Hebrews. And no scholar today would argue that Paul wrote Hebrews. And no scholar has argued that Paul wrote Hebrews for probably 70 years. And those were some pre-Vatican II Catholic scholars. Even then, in the 1940s, I think, was the last serious scholarly argument for Paul as the author of Hebrews. The style is different. The categories are related but slightly different, and I do believe that the author of Hebrews probably was related in some way to the Pauline circle or in contact with the Pauline circle. By the way, I refer to the author as a he because of a masculine singular participle in chapter 11, verse 32, where the author gives away his gender. I wouldn't have minded if the author was female. It just isn't at all likely given the evidence. But for me, the style of Hebrews is not the knockout for Pauline authorship. For me, this verse right here is the strongest argument. I mean, there's no 100% argument. If you really had to argue for Paul as the author to save your life, you could do it. But in terms of what the most probable reading is, this verse just doesn't sound like Paul, because the author here puts himself in as it were, the second layer of Christianity. The Lord spoke this salvation, and then there were those who heard the Lord speak this salvation, and then there are people like me, the author of Hebrews, who heard the people who heard the Lord. This does not sound like Paul at all. Paul goes to extraordinary lengths in his writings to say, am I not an apostle? Have I not seen the Lord? 1 Corinthians 9. In another place he says, I don't think that I'm one bit inferior to these so-called super apostles. And there he might, I'm not sure exactly whether he's referring to people like Peter there. He might be referring to a different kind of apostle like Apollos. I'm not sure. But basically it is very difficult to see the Apostle Paul putting himself as a second-hand recipient of the word of salvation. Paul emphasizes in Galatians, for example, that he received his revelation directly from the Lord. The author of Hebrews doesn't put himself in that category. And so this verse here alone makes it overwhelmingly unlikely that the Apostle Paul was the author of Hebrews. And then this not only was it confirmed spoken by the Lord, but it was confirmed by signs and wonders and various powers, expressions of power, and divisions of the Holy Spirit. And so this goes to the fact that Jesus, not just Jesus, but the early Christians, under the power of the Holy Spirit, did signs and wonders and miraculous things that confirmed that in fact this new revelation was in fact the true revelation about what God was doing in terms of salvation. So in these short 4 verses, the author does what he will do numerous times. We stop the presses, we interrupt the train of thought in this argument to bring you a commercial about how you need to really pay attention to what we're saying here, because your eternal salvation is at stake.